name's Stanley. I've been working with Black-throated Finches at James Cook University in Townsville. I only just recently moved down to Sydney just before Christmas last year to sort of get rid of the, try to escape from the heat in the tropics. And I didn't know it's this cold in Sydney right now. So anyway, with jacket and everything. So okay, so. My talk is going to be on the granular spurs in decline and with a specific focus on the black-throated finches. So in Australia, I'm sure everyone knows what a granular spur is, right? So the birds that eat seeds, basically. So in Australia, we have quail-like birds like quails and buttonquails and finches and grass parrots and also pigeons and doves. So these are the granular spurs in Australia. They make up a large proportion of the overall bird communities in Australia. And also, surprisingly, over a third of these bird communities in Australia that are declining are granular spurs. So granular spurs are actually really, really in danger. Due to a lot of reasons, because first of all, they require water daily, and they do need to eat a lot of food as well. And sometimes they form large flocks, and that can put them in danger if a fire or something can wipe the entire population out quite easily. The decline of the granular spurs are the biggest in the northern part of the country. A lot of the species, I'm sure all of you guys already know, the starfinch, Galilee Finch, Darwin firetails, the southern subspecies, the black-throated finches, all this golden-shouldered parrots and partridge pigeon, and also the white-banded crows and finches as well. So the changes in the landscapes have caused species to decline, as Perry has already explained how that affects the genetic diversity of the species. So I'm going to go, and also the survival of the species. So I'm not going to go into details about this bit. Like Perry said, I do have a cool example of how the inbreeding works in the declining or small populations. So this is the California condor from America, obviously. So in the 1980s, there was only about 14 individuals left in the wild. A really, really small population. And that's when people start to worry this species is not going to survive. So the government spent a lot of money capturing all of them, all of the 14 individuals from the wild, and kept them in captivity. And up to date, there are about 230 of these birds fly in the wild. They're all coming from those 14 individuals. And there's still about 160 living in captivity, and they still keep on breeding these birds. So we have only 14 individuals. That poses, increases the chance of those really lethal genetic signals to be passed on to the offspring. And in fact, for these guys, there was one. It's called the lethal chondral dystrophy allele. So what it does is basically cause the offspring to become really, really small, dwarf genes, basically, and that's lethal in a lot of the offspring. So that caused a lot of offspring die in captivity. So that's basically, in the wild, if you have a really large population, that kind of lethal genetic signal, the chance of that lethal signal to be passed on is really low because you have really large gene pool to select individuals to not pass on that gene. But when you have only 14 individuals, if some of them have that gene, the chance of that really lethal gene to be passed on within that small population is really, really high. So that's why, and then usually when this thing happens, we'll call it inbreeding depression. So that's the inbreeding depression, where they basically reduce the survival of the populations, and also continue fragmentation of habitat also will cause the genetic diversity or the genetic differentiation between populations to be larger and larger. And this is an example of the, I don't know if you guys recognize the species. There's also a bird from America. It's really pretty warbler. It's a golden-cheeked warbler. So basically, this is an endangered species as well. What happens here is there's two different graphs. Shows how the top one is the percentage of forest. So as you have on the axis, if you go towards my side, you have more forest, and then on the y-axis is the distance, the genetic distance. So as you have more forest, your genetic distance is decreasing. So basically, birds are more connected when you have more forest. On the contrary, when you have more agricultural land, the genetic distance is getting further and further. So the agricultural land acts as barrier to the connectivity between populations of these birds. So the more agricultural land they have, the more those bigger populations will be separated into smaller populations. When you have a lot of smaller populations, then the inbreeding depression is more likely to act to reduce the survival of the species. Okay, another aspect is a lot of people are talking about captive breeding. So this is a study done on zebra finches to look at the genetic diversity between the wild zebra finches and the captive zebra finches. And all these samples over here are coming from captive stock all over the world. Some are Canada, America, Australia, Europe, a lot of stocks of captive zebra finches, and there's two wild populations from Alice Springs and Victoria. As you can see, on the x-axis it measures the genetic diversity. So all the captive populations have much lower genetic diversity comparing with two wild populations of zebra finches, which basically means all the zebra finches that we have now in captivity have lost a great deal of the genetic diversity comparing the wild ones. So that leads to basically my research. I'm looking at these guys over here, the black-throated finches. Right now we officially recognize two subspecies. The southern one, which has a white rump, you guys call it Parsons, and the northern one has black rump. I think it's called Eagles. Yes, there you go. So the white rumped Parson finches are considered as the endangered ones, and the black rump one is relatively common. So this is the sort of historical distribution of the black-throated finches. So the Parsons sort of historically occurs just around north of Townsville all the way down to northern edge of New South Wales. And the black rump ones, the sort of rapid decline of the black-throated finches in the wild, I really wanted to know whether the genetic diversity has lost in these populations or not. And also whether the survival of the populations in the wild is going to be a problem, whether the birds can sort of recover on their own, or we have to sort of step in and help them out. So I want to look at the relationship between our current landscape features, like agricultural land, land clearing for cattle grazing or forest, all those sort of different landscape features, how these features are going to affect the genetic structure of the black-throated finches. I used Townsville population as an example to examine that. Also wanted to look at overall genetic diversity of all the existing populations of black-throated finches in the wild. And then the last, I will compare the captive birds and wild birds to look at the differences in terms of the genetic diversity. So I went out, I actually did all the field work around with a lot of other volunteers. I set up mist nets. I know Sam was talking about some other experienced finch trappers don't really like using mist nets. We have no choice because of the legislation, so we had to use mist nets, but it took us more than a year to actually manage to catch a bird. But in the end, we learned, we caught a lot of other birds, but just not black-throated finch. Everything else. But
I'll help.
But anyway, now we know exactly how to catch these guys. We, catch like loads of them if we find the right place. And then we take blood under the wing, and then put them on the card and bring them back to the lab and extract the DNA. Also, this is not part of my project. This is part of another PhD student's project. Is to look at the movement of the finches, see how far they travel. So we put radio transmitters on these guys and radio track them to see how far they can move. This radio transmitter is really, really tiny, about 1.2 grams. So yeah, really tiny little thing. And then we obviously tag each individual that we caught, color band, so we don't have to trap them again and read the numbers on the leg. So you can read the color combination. So this guy is blue, yellow, something metal, and stuff like that. And we also look at parasites on the birds. So all the wild birds, most of the wild birds, if you look at your primaries and tail feathers, will be loads of parasites. And some will have fewer, so you can use that as an indicator of how healthy the birds are, and also looking at their breeding condition by looking at the brood patch and stuff like that. So my sampling sort of covers some major populations. In Queensland, I've got samples from Cape York, which is the black-throated, the diggles, and then Mareeba wetlands, we've got also diggles, about 16 birds from there. And Townsville, I got about, that's where I got most of my samples from, 143. And then another population in central Queensland, in desert upland near Lake Buchanan. In Townsville itself, I've got basically all the smaller populations are around Ross River Dam. There's two major populations on either side of the dam. Alright, just want to mention one more thing. This population here, from desert upland, I'm very proud to announce I discovered a population of 400 birds. Probably the largest known population that we know so far, which is great. And it happens to be on the biggest mine that Australia is going to build in the southern hemisphere. Anyway, I've also got the captive birds from a lot of awesome breeders, including some of you here, to help me differentiate between wild and captive birds. So I've got about 97 birds altogether. Oh, they're all coming from different origins. Many of them have no origins, like the ones I got from Townsville, they have no idea where the birds came from. Probably. The birds from air, they were actually trapped from air in the wild, not long ago, illegally. Brisbane, so these birds, most of them from Murgon, like in southern part of Queensland and Rockhampton, and some of them from New South Wales as well. So hopefully I can have a look at the diversity of these birds. Okay, so some of the results. This is the graph that Perry trying to explain about the Galilee finches. And this is this sort of similar thing. Each of these bars represent one individual. And then each color represents one sort of genetic cluster, like genetic group. Similarly, all the individuals have similar genetic signature. I put them in the same color. So once I run the analysis, it shows me that all the Townsville birds are pretty much yellow. And all the birds in central Queensland and desert upland are sort of mostly yellow, a little bit blue. And the birds in far north Queensland from Mareeba and Cape York, the black-throated birds are all mostly blue. So you can see the genetic separation between two different subspecies. And also the birds from central Queensland is slightly different from the birds in Townsville, even though they are the same subspecies. And these are the birds just from Townsville, from those five different small populations around the Ross River Dam. And you can see the three different clusters here. One is FOD, the different locations. So this is to the west side, east side of the dam, and these are the birds from west side of the dam. And these are the populations, sort of smaller populations scattered around in between. So we see there's a migration, and there's also a separation. So the big Ross River Dam acts as a barrier for the birds living on both sides of the dam to connect, even though they can fly around. We also see some of the birds from the west side of the dam sort of start to travel around through some corridors around the dam to travel, so the genetic signature are actually connected, but also stay separate. This is the example that I did. It is not a complete analysis. This is just to show you how different the wild black-throated finches are from the captive birds. So all the blue colors on the right are the captive birds. There are 4 odd ones, and they look very similar to the wild ones. So possibly... Anyway, these are the wild ones from Okay, so we can see a very strong separation between the captive bird and wild bird. And based on this, we're probably not going to recommend at this stage to implement any captive breeding. The reason for that is because the genetic diversity is very different, and also what's more important is that the captive birds have been in captivity for so long, they've lost the ability to adapt to the environment, also the ability to move long distance to, to find food and to find water, to avoid predation, all that sort of things. So it's a very, very complicated process for captive bred birds to be released to the back, back to the wild. Sorry, it's been really late. Okay, there's just one last note. After caught I handled the black-throated finches, I did find a little bit of mutation in the wild birds. I don't know if it is of interest to you guys. Some of the birds in the tails start to have white colors, like some of the tail completely white. Some of the birds have white tips, only on the outer tail feathers. And some birds in the central feather sort of start to look like a long-tailed finch. Some of them really, really long, some of them almost nothing. There's nothing there. So it's quite interesting to look at a variation of the feather features in the wild.
Also, those 2 slides on the side there,
yeah.
The left-hand one almost appears to be fawn in colour.
Probably just even like the reflection to the photos. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so this is a photo that I took from central Queensland of that massive flock of black-throated finches I discovered last year. I couldn't put all the birds in one photo because I have a really long lens and only cover a small area, but there are about 120 birds in a single photo, and it was only like less than half of the whole population. So yeah, and they form like little heart shapes standing on their branches. It looks really cool. Anyway, question time.
Is the mine going to destroy their habitat and move them on?
Well, it's open cut mine. They're going to destroy everything there pretty much. Right. Yeah.
So, do you know, like roughly where's the mine planned to go in relation
to? You can probably look it up on the internet. Adani mine is right there where that dot is. And that's Townsville. And that's Lake Buchanan, and then that's Lake Galilee. So
how widely did you search in that area? Like how did you go about to actually locate the population? What led you to that area? Yeah.
Oh, the people in mine took me over to the spot and know the birds were there.
Word of mouth.
Yeah.
With the example of the dam, where you've got sort of two separate populations and then you've got a bit of a cross-pollination going on,
Yeah.
is that a bit of a blueprint for sustained kind of life over time, or?
What happens is the dam wasn't there 60 years ago. So the dam was only built about 60 years ago. So you can see the difference over 60 years time. You can see the separation of maybe before the dam was built, all the birds here were connected. It's really sort of, there's no barrier whatsoever. It's just plain grassland. So they were connected. Once the dam was built, the birds were separate by the dam. And then the corridor is still connecting. So this area, this bit is all grassland. All this land become grazing properties. And there's all barren. There's nothing there. So the birds sort of don't really go across there anymore. However, through here, these are all mountain ranges. This is Mount Stewart, and this is sort of Harvey Range over there. So the birds sort of starting to, there are birds still living there, probably coming from there because they're very similar from my analysis. And then through there, these are all mountain ranges, so it's very hard to go through these mountain ranges. So these birds actually coming from here, and these two are very similar. And these birds are very similar to that. So this is the source population for those smaller, or we call it sink populations. So these populations are probably not going to survive. I sampled these in 2012. So they probably, when we went there in 2013, they were not there anymore. So the possibility that is sink populations that coming from these bigger source populations, and they just hang out there for a year and next year they're gone.
The reason I ask, I guess if at the end of the day trying to sustain the population in the wild and combat inbreeding depression, would that be to introduce hybrid vigour into the population?
Introduce the...
A hybrid vigour, basically a different genetic set of the same species that introduce more vigour into the line.
Yeah, it's possible, but because we don't really know how healthy the captive finches are.
Not necessarily captive, I guess that's why I asked there. If you've got a bit of a geographic separation,
It's possible,
if they become more different,
yeah.
When they're reintroduced over however many years, potentially going to reinvigorate the population.
Yeah, so that's the biggest thing that I'm proposing is one of the management strategies that we need to do is to maintain that sort of habitat connectivity. So the birds that are separated, they should be able to connect through even, whatever habitat they prefer, they can go through that.
Vegetation corridors.
Yes, vegetation corridors, exactly.
So the last question I had on that topic, sorry to hijack a bit there, but when you're talking about the locally bred or captive bred and the problem with, you mentioned the diversity is one thing, but also the ability to be released in the wild. If you're able to get rid of the problem of releasing them and have a way of, I guess, letting them be able to survive, would that be the cross between? Potentially, is there a problem with the genetic diversity of captive bred broilers?
You mean like just leave them in the wild and let them survive?
No, I mean if you're able to find a method, it would be a massive, like, I don't know, whatever that method was, but as far as the genetic code of those birds, would there be a problem if they could survive introducing them into the population? Would that introduce the vigour that you potentially need, or is that a problem?
It's possible because we don't really know the difference here, whether they're good or they're different. Because many of these captive birds are inbred. They're coming from only some people keep 2 pairs or something. The offspring are inbred, so they might potentially have a lot of genetic defects. And if we introduce them, and basically we're introducing bad genes to the wild population.
Can I add something to that as well? I mean, if we've also got a small population size, we're entering into, there's not going to be much necessarily diversity in that captive population, so it might be a lot of money and effort spent to not add a lot of genetic diversity in the first place into that population. But it is worth investigating more.
Stanley, if that mine, and I understand from what I have heard, that mine's going to pretty much ruin the environment for that group that you found down near Rockhampton, wouldn't it be advisable to move the birds, maybe up to Townsville or a better environment?
Well,
would they survive?
Clive Palmer said when he was questioned about that, he said, yeah, they have wings, they can fly.
The
White parsons used to be down in North New South Wales over the chocolate one. A different one altogether to what you're talking about.
Yes, Bruce just shot me a photo of the ones he has, and it's really dark. No.
They stopped the trapping of the ordinary ones in Queensland in 1972. Billy Stewart up there would go away, he'd be away for about 8 days and he'd have a full truckload of too. I'm talking about a full truckload of parsons.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to any of the old trappers that are up there?
Right.
I'll speak to Johnny Kruger, he'll tell you they're thick up there in different areas. You're probably not going where they are.
Yeah, so the problem with that is because this finch has caused so much political controversy, and a lot of the landholders, they pretty much say, no, don't come to my land, I don't want any trouble, just...
Is there any, what's the latest on what's going to happen with those birds with that mine?
Well, from the environmental perspective, the government would obviously ask the mine to find offsets. Offsets can be either land, pieces of land, that are potentially suitable habitat, and they're hoping the finches will fly into that offset in the surrounding area and survive there. Or if we couldn't find any suitable offset piece of land, they can provide money, put into conservation or build a suitable habitat somewhere. So, which is basically their job. Trapping finches in Mareeba. When we finished processing the birds and releasing them, not black-throats, other finches, like chestnut-breasted manakins and stuff, there are like 5 birds just waiting. As soon as you let one finch go, the 5 bird, it was supposed to be honey, came straight down and grabbed the finch and just took off. So it's even though they're wild finches, they're all wild birds, and still, as soon as the condition is changed, birds are very opportunistic. Like everything can be a predator, and
Talking about your Firebird, just quickly, if you know a little bit about the Firebird, read a book called Where Song Began. You know that? It's unbelievable about how aggressive our birds are in Australia compared to anywhere else in the world.
yeah.
Can I ask you one question? When we were up looking at on the Galilee count, we found that the vast majority are uncoloured birds.
Yes.
Young birds, very few.
Same for
Is
black.
it the same?
Yeah, same for black-throats. What we think is probably because the pressure that these birds have gone through, and their turnover rate is really, really fast.
Yeah.
So basically, the wild ones might live only for like 1 or 2 years and they're just gone, and then they leave all those young birds. Every year they breed and they produce so much offspring, and then the adult birds just keep on dying, and then more offspring. So most of the time we caught are just juvenile birds. Yeah.
Same as the Goonies, but
It's probably similar to Goonies, or they move somewhere else.